I'm Bennie Covington, originally from Hawfields. I've been away for periods of time, but not too long at one time. Went to Alexander Wilson for 12 years.
All right. And how long have you been a member here?
I don't know exactly, but since the middle 1940s, so we can figure that up if you want to. Lifetime almost.
And can you tell me about your childhood? Like, if you moved anywhere, what churches you've been
I
in?
lived right down 119 from here, and other than being away at school or that sort of thing, I've lived there all my life, or growing up at least. Yeah.
Did you switch churches at all?
Not now. I went to school in Raleigh and worked there a while, so I did move my membership to a church in Cary for, I'm going to say 6, 8 years. I don't know exactly. And then also, when I came back here, we lived out beyond Eastern High School, and we went to Crossroads Presbyterian Church for a few years, and eventually moved back here.
How were you baptized?
By not immersion, by I think you call it sprinkle.
Sprinkle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Words don't come real fast.
It's fine. Can you tell me how this church is related to other churches in the area? If they got started by this, are they sister churches, just stuff like that?
Yeah, there's a number of churches that came out of this church, so to speak. The Mebane Church, Bethany Church over on 87 south of Graham, the Graham Church. There's a church down about halfway to Chapel Hill, Bethlehem Church, that came out of this church. Now the first church in Burlington actually came out of the Graham Church, so it's sort of considered a grandchild of this church. Since,
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is Graham Presbyterian related to this one?
Yeah, it came out of this church, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the church has 3 locations. Can you tell me about those and where you think the church's buildings may have been?
Okay, the original location, do you know where the new Japanese candy factory is in Mebane? You know where that is?
Yeah.
Okay, the original church was right behind that. There's about I'm going to say an acre or so of land that actually belongs to this church.
Okay.
You can sort of identify it because there's some big trees there, and all around is pasture, with the exception of this candy factory right in front of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the church began, and there was one temporary building there, then one permanent building there, and then sometime, and I don't have those dates down to memory, but sometime, say in the late 1700s, they moved to this area.
Okay.
And the church was across in the cemetery. The line of the cemetery, of course, you can see the stones, and then there's a wooded area. Mm-hmm. But it'd be right this side of that wooded area, about halfway back in there. Now, if you walk back in there, there's a mark or a big stone that identifies where the building was.
So the stone was where the building was?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I just went there yesterday.
You what?
I went there yesterday.
Oh, you saw it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Mm-hmm. You checking me out then?
Yeah. And the second location, I understand, was in the cemetery, the new cemetery. So can you tell us about that, where the marker was and all that?
I think what we just described was where both those buildings were over there.
Both the buildings?
I think. I'm not sure about that.
Okay. So, was there 3 locations or 2?
It depends on if you consider this property and the cemetery as the same property.
Okay.
If you're talking about this was separate, then there'd be 3 locations.
Okay.
In other words, a location down at the candy factory, the location over in the cemetery, and then its present location. In that case, you'd say 3, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So was there ever a building right there, or was that just the cemetery across the road?
No, there was a building there.
There was a building?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So can you tell me where that was? Was it near the marker? Was it
Yeah, it was
on
right
top
at the
of it?
marker, yeah.
Okay. I think I've been there. So. What was the biggest controversy you remember?
We had a preacher that filled in after a preacher had left, and a lot of people thought he was great. A lot of people didn't want him at all.
Mm-hmm.
He was, well, I'm trying to be careful how I say this. He was a little more fundamental than this church normally is, but there was a lot of controversy over that, and then eventually the man left, and it was all settled more or less. This was back, I'm going to say around 1950, somewhere in that.
50s.
Yeah.
And I understand the peak of the church was around the 50s as well?
Yeah, early 50s, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was, I think we had an enrollment of over 400 people for a time there, yeah.
So all of the buildings were in use, right?
Yeah. Now, all these buildings weren't built by 1950. This building is a little newer than that.
Mm-hmm. This was 65?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But they were in use, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about like the different styled buildings over time? So I understand the first one was just a roof of leaves.
Yeah. First one, have you seen the models over
Yes.
there? Okay. So you can get the exact dates off of those little cards.
Okay.
First one was what they used to call a bush arbor. Essentially, it was some posts with a little frame on it with some limbs with leaves, just for,
Okay.
I think, just mainly to protect you from the sun. I don't see how it would have helped any in cold weather.
Yeah.
Maybe shade was the main thing. And then they built there were a couple of log buildings, and then of course the current sanctuary was built in 1850s, I think 1852 to 54, right in that neighborhood. And it was originally just the sanctuary. The Sunday school rooms were added on about 1920, and of course they did a good job of matching it up and all. But if you somehow if you go up in the attic and all, the new part of it wasn't as well constructed as the original part. That's in my opinion, you know.
Yeah.
But it stood there all this time anyway. Now you realize, of course, that the brick for that building came from over here where the elementary school is.
No, I did not.
They were they dug up the red topsoil, and of course they used the term fired them. That means they baked them to make them hard. And when they first built that school, they were having trouble getting the grass to grow. And I told them, I says, well, the reason you can't get any grass, the topsoil is all over in that building.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Hawfields
Elementary.
Elementary and Middle School, right down behind the
Okay.
store there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how the first location and the second location, how that transitioned. So can you tell us what kind of times that was?
I don't know much about that actually.
Okay.
See, when they came, early settlers here tended to connect themselves with Hillsborough more than back this direction, or of course Graham didn't even exist, nor Burlington, so
Yeah.
there was a draw in that direction sort of. But eventually people got to moving around more and settle more. This area right here was a very good area to settle in, because there were trees available, but there was also open land available. Now, that brings up a whole question as to how that came about, and we actually don't know. Now, my guess is that at some time way back, there was a big fire and burned over this whole area right here, say from between Alexander Wilson and Mebane, and between Hall River and toward Eflin, because it was a section here that the topography and all was entirely different. There were grassland, there were berries growing that animals could eat, that kind of thing. Whereas if you started toward Chapel Hill, you ran into a whole lot of undergrowth. It was almost impossible to walk through it, you know. It was a long time before there was a road or way to travel, say down where 54 is now. That's a relatively new road because it was so hard to get through there.
Okay.
So that's about all we know about how that actually happened.
So can you tell me more about the forestry and like how the grassland was split up and how that's attractive to people?
I'm sure at first they just came in and settled without any official deeds or titles or anything like that. Eventually, some people began to make claims on the land, and there were land was sold. I'm sure there were a few crooks involved in this land selling. You know, some people made some money on it. I'm sure. That's just human nature. But as far as the forester was concerned, now you can look up in the attic of the sanctuary building, and the ceiling joists, and you know what I mean by the ceiling joists. That's big supports that run across, hold up the ceiling. They are tremendous pieces of wood, maybe 16 inches by 3 inches. That's that's a big piece of wood. Mm-hmm. There had to be some big trees here to saw those out of. You probably couldn't find many trees around here now that you could saw those out of. And it's always been amazing to me that just when they got ready to build these churches, those trees were ready to cut too. So I don't, you can interpret that in all kind of ways. But,
mm-hmm. Is there anything you want to share about how the Scott Irish and all those people came down?
Well, of course, we know that there were primarily two main entrances to the colonial U.S. The Philadelphia area or the Pennsylvania area is one. And then there was an area over in, it was north of Norfolk up there. It never was a big town, but there was a place, some settlers came in there. Now, it's sort of strange. The people that came in north of Norfolk there tended to just migrate straight across Virginia. Very few of them came down into North Carolina at first. The people, when Lancaster County, which is just west of Philadelphia, when it started growing, people realized it was going to get crowded, and they didn't want to sell their land. So they started coming south. And there was I guess we'd call it a trail. It certainly wasn't a highway. Came down through Virginia, through the Shenandoah Valley, would have come over to Roanoke, from there to Danville, and then from Danville down through Caswell County to Hillsborough. Now that's the way most of the people that came here early on, that's the way they got here. Very few came straight down from the coast, so to speak. There was development on the coast, say down Wilmington in the area. There was development in this area, but very little connection because it was so hard to travel between here and the coast.
Can you tell me how you think the trails were made, why they were made there? Were there fault lines?
Most of this started out as Indian trails. you know, most of the Indians moved around a lot. They didn't stay in one place very long. So I think most of it was their trails, and the trails became really crooked because if a mud hole developed here, instead of anybody fixing it, they just moved the trail down in a circle around it. So after a long period of time, you can imagine what that created was some really crooked trails that they had to follow. But that's what were used early on, you know. Well, of course, flue-cured tobacco didn't develop right here, but it wasn't too far away, and it had an influence on. They used to send tobacco back to Europe, England. Now, I don't want to get into the discussion if that was a good thing or a bad thing. You know, we sort of tobacco gotten a bad name, but it was important back at that time because it was something the settlers could sell and ship, and there were a lot of pine trees, and they used to call that naval stores. Now, how that ever got that name, I have no idea. Maybe they did use some of the products on ships, but they turpentine, different products that came from these pine trees, and of course for building log cabins and eventually for cutting lumber. Longleaf pines grew natural in eastern North Carolina. Some others grew natural in this area. Of course, at one time there was a lot of walnut trees in this area, and they were cut, made some really high-priced furniture, and a lot of that was shipped back to Europe or England. So the natural resources had a big development there. From there, it sort of went to begin to get into the textile industry, and at first the textile mills had to be on a river to get water power. There was no, of course, electricity available. Electricity came into this area. I'm gonna say about 1920s, give or take a couple of years there. We're at about as far east as you can go and still get generate electricity from flowing water. You know, you get down to flatland, you don't have any water wheels.
Can you tell me about this map? How like the rivers and all are significant in the divide between, you know, Mebane and Graham and
Here's. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll give you an example. Early on, and I don't mean back in 1700, say on up in the 1800s, there was at least one prominent family from Haw River that came to church here. Now, they had to come either riding horses or in a buggy. Now, as far as I know, they had to go almost to Swepsonville to ford Haw River and come back here to get to church. Now, that's pretty good ways to go from Haw River, and I'm talking about the town of Haw River. They lived out, you know, as you go out Haw River, out 49, right, on the right there's a big old house with some columns there. You probably never noticed, but that's where they lived. But they were very active in this church, and were for over a period of time. The rivers had almost control over development because you weren't going to go way off the river if you were dependent on that for either electric power. Now, at one time, they used barges up and down Haw River, the river itself, and there was trying to, you know how Jim Miner Road goes out to 54? Mm-hmm. Okay, that used to go straight on across It does a little ways now, but that used to go straight on across, and there was a low slung bridge there, and that's the way you went to Graham. The Highway 54 and those bridges, I don't mean they are new, but they're relatively new compared to a lot of other places. And there was a time when they would ship cloth or some materials from the town of Fall River down the river to Swepsonville, but when they got to that low bridge, it wouldn't go under it, so they had to unload the barges, carry them around, take the barges under, load them back up, and then go on to Swepsonville. Yeah, that's a lot of labor, but that's just what they did.
Yeah. Is there anything else about this map
Well,
you would like to talk about?
let me look here just a minute.
Okay.
A lot of changes
Mm-hmm.
since this map was made, and you know, all this work going on right up here on the interstate is almost unbelievable. You know, I can remember when, of course, the interstate didn't exist in any form, and then I was away in the military 1954 and 55, and when I left, they had started the interstate, and when I got back, just two lanes were open, maybe as far as Greensboro or somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know, High Point or something. So it's been a tremendous amount of change just based on that highway. Now, I don't know that all that's good, but I guess that's got to be, you know.
Mm-hmm. So was the I-40, I-85, was that part of a big trading path that the Indians first started?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Because the trade path used to come from Hillsborough and almost down the back of our cemetery. There's a marker out there somewhere, I'd have to hunt for it,
Okay.
that somebody put indicating that was on the trading path. And it went on down by where the water tank is. And do you know where Fenton and Eva live? You know where their house is? Okay, it used to be a roadbed that came down around that field that was the trading path. Of course, after plowing and all that, you can't see it anymore. The old house where, and I doubt you remember, where Ricky and Kathy lived, there was a log house there. You don't remember that. That was a stagecoach station there, and a barn where they switched horses. In other words, they'd come in with a set of horses and then put in some fresh horses to go the next, I don't know how far, maybe 50 or 60 miles or something. But that was an Indian trail, and then it evolved into a stagecoach trail. And of course, the stagecoaches had to follow these trails, and it was very inefficient because they went all over the country, whereas the interstate goes straight, you know. So,
Mm-hmm. Fenton and Eva, can tell me where that marker is?
there, no, the marker is in the cemetery.
In the cemetery?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's, I'd have to hunt for it. It's,
Okay.
if you go out the street that goes right across from the daycare, somewhere out there and off to the left, it's just a small marker that
Okay.
indicates that's where the old trading path went.
And I know it's 20 degrees outside, so I won't.
I know, yeah.
I won't take you out there now, but
Yeah, maybe we can walk out there sometime,
yeah.
walk over the cemetery.
So can you get into more of your youth here? What kind of activities did you do?
Well, of course, the church had a youth program, and we were, most of us, as we came along, we call it the young peoples, you know, and met on Sunday night. We went to Sunday school. Wasn't compared to now, it wasn't a whole lot to do. Early on, you just didn't jump in the car and run over to Graham somewhere just to be going. You know, cars were expensive. They were expensive to operate, and people simply didn't have money other than to drive to work and back and maybe to church or something like that. But we used to ride bicycles up and down 119 without thinking if there's any traffic, because there was very little traffic out there, in the middle of the day, practically no cars or trucks are going up and down the road, that kind of thing. About 1950, they built we first called it the gymnasium, but the room out there, and we used that. We did some roller skating in the basement. Mm-hmm. We'd open doors and come around through the hall and back, and it wasn't that bad a pattern actually. Mm-hmm. So and then they played basketball inside the building. None of this playground equipment. Of course, the daycare wasn't there. The shelter wasn't there. None of that was there at that time.
Not even the baseball field?
No.
Okay.
That was just...
Did you ever play baseball?
No. I wasn't much on playing ball.
Yeah.
We, for the most part, people like me started about the 7th, 8th grade, just started milking cows for somebody. I first milked for, where Ralph Scott lived, mm-hmm. and the barn out there's been converted to a house. I milked cows in there for several years. And then I went up to, who John Kimmery was, the big old barn back this way.
On 119?
It's between 119 and the road where all the buildings are going up.
Kimmery?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I milked cows in there for a year or so. Mm. He had a lot of cows. We milked about 80 cows in that long barn. You went in and work your way all the way mm-hmm. Down. But
how long did you do that?
Maybe just 1 year. I can't remember exactly. Then I went off to school mm-hmm. from that.
So you said you taught for how many years?
I taught at Eastern for 31 years. Well, schooling is there's a lot of good and there's a lot of some bad goes along with about anything, Yeah. But it was a good experience, and I've got a lot of people, former students out there that I speak to and talk to, and I feel sure a lot of them, if I ever needed help, I could ask them, But a lot of good people. But the problem with schools, you hear about 1 out of 100 that causes all the trouble, and that's you don't hear about the other 99 most of the time. But I had worked when I went to state. I had worked there in the summer, cotton insect research. In other words, we were testing insecticides, and we did most of the work down around Laurinburg. Have you heard of the Presbyterian College at Laurinburg, St. Andrews?
I think they went to Montreat with us. I'm not sure.
Okay. Anyway, I was working down there when they built that campus. Mm-hmm. I had worked there about 2 years and decided, well, Eastern was going to open up. It was new. I came there this summer. It opened up, and stayed there for 31 years. I went to state about 2 years. Of course, at that time, state was on a quarter system instead of semester system, so it worked out a little different. But in the January of 1955, I'd run out of money anyway, so I decided to go just tell them to draft me in the Army, and I went. My brother Neil and I went in at the same time. The first week of January 1955, and we both ended up in Korea. Of course, at that point the actual fighting had stopped, but everything was just sitting there, just like it had been, Mm-hmm. So then I came back and finished school and worked there for a while, and eventually moved back here. Came back. I started Eastern 1962.
And Eastern started when?
1962. Yeah, it was new, brand new building.
Mm-hmm. Would you say the facilities are much nicer now?
Yeah, it's of course they've added on some.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is the same, but it's a nice building now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Is there anything else you would like to tell me about Eastern and your college life?
Well, I worked most of the time. At one point, you're familiar with the Scots and Melville Dairy. You know all about that. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
they had a distribution point in Raleigh. It was called Smith Melville Dairy. And at one point, I hauled the milk down every afternoon. In other words, all the milk was bottled in Burlington, and then had this refrigerated trailer. The milk that was to go to Raleigh was put on that. But I would come up from Raleigh and get that and go back. For most people back then, there was no money floating around that you could go to college without working or something, so I did that for a while, and then I worked at the college for a while, which led into, as I told you, a full-time job and I stayed there for about 2 years. I lived out. You wouldn't even recognize the area now, but right behind the state fairground. It was all wooded, but there was a little house out there where I lived, and that's all changed. You can't even identify what the streets anymore.
Were you in the Scouts?
Actually, no, but I was a scout leader. Now that sounds strange, but scouts and milking cows didn't mix, and milking cows had to come first. But after we came back here, I had 3 sons that were in the Scouts, and all made Eagle, and I was a scout leader for about 10 years. And basically what I did, and I don't say this in a critical sense at all, but there was a group of men that took them camping, and that was about all they did. They weren't working on get promoted, consequently very few of them ever made Eagle. So I started working on that and would conduct merit badge classes, just take 6, 8 boys and go out and whatever it called for, we just go do that, and so we got a number of boys promoted during, and I don't say this bragging, but simply during that 10 years, we got a bunch of boys promoted to Eagle,
Yeah, when was that?
Probably around 1970, maybe 1965 to 75 in that neighborhood, yeah.
Because I know there was a National Honor Unit recognition from the committee from the Boy Scouts given in the 80s.
But now that wasn't with this church. The group I worked with was in Mebane, and it was sponsored by the Baptist and Methodist churches. No, I'm sorry. The Baptist and Presbyterian church, sponsored by the Presbyterian church in Mebane. So I never did work with the Scouts in this church.
Can you tell me more about being a leader?
I was a committee member, actually, but there was a period of time that the Scout-master got sick, and I served as Scout-master. We never did make it official, but I was actually doing Scout-master duty, and that was an interesting thing, As always, you had some good things and some bad things going on. I went to camp with them several times, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm.
Still at the Cherokee Reservation?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you would like to tell me?
Let me think a minute.
All right.
Well, I maybe should say that this church and this community is and has been a good place to live. It's a good place for to grow up, so to speak, and it's changing so fast. You just don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I guess we'll just have to deal with it. Of course, I'm not going to be around that much longer anyway. But people like you going to have to deal with all these changes. I mean, we used to. People wouldn't believe this now, but do you know? Do you know who Billy Scott is? Henderson's younger brother. You may not ever.
I'm not sure.
He hadn't been to church here lately. Anyway, we were next door neighbors, and we had bicycles, and we got us a light on the bicycle. But we used to get out there and ride up and down 119 at night. Think nothing about it, I wouldn't even walk across out there now. Cause such a change.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my father's family was originally from here for generations. My mother's family came here from Pennsylvania in 1916. And I can remember my grandfather talking about he rode a train to Mebane, got off, and the road coming out here was so muddy you could hardly walk. But he walked out here, and he bought the farm up here where you don't remember the chicken farm up there, or do you?
Where was it?
Where
was it?
Just this side of the interstate, where Smithfield and all that is.
No, I don't.
You don't remember? Okay. He bought that 40 acres and a small house there, and that's where they came. My mother had finished high school it was just outside of Philadelphia. And what's interesting, she had taken typing in high school at that time. We didn't get typing in high school here until about 1950 or so. And, we don't like to admit it, but those schools were just that far ahead of us here. That's no put down on anything. That's just the way it was. But I guess we pretty well covered everything. If you got any more questions or whatever.
Would you like to give them any advice?
Well, not really. I'm probably not a person that ought to be giving a lot of advice, but I think I would like to see more interest in this church as such. I hate to see it keep struggling to stay active. I hope that at some point it will take a upward swing as far as membership and that sort of thing, because certainly it's worth preserving, and that would be the only thing I would hope for as far as this community and all is concerned. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We're going to get a picture.